Welcome to Spotlight. We're joined by Mike Gerson, a nationally syndicated columnist for the Washington Post. He is also a contributor to Newsweek and the author of the book Heroic Conservatism. He's a senior research fellow at the Institute for Global Engagement. Mr. Gerson was a top aide for President George W. Bush as assistant to the president for policy and strategic planning. Also joining us, Mark Rodgers is a principal and co-founder of the Clapham Group, a Christian consulting firm. He also served as the third-ranking Republican leadership staffer in the U.S. Senate for 6 years, overseeing strategic planning and strategic communications. Currently, he serves as a fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center. Both helped co-found the Poverty Forum. Thanks for joining us.
Sure, good to be here.
What do faith communities bring to the fight against poverty?
Well, you know, they have comparative advantages. The faith community can't do everything. They can't provide health care. They can't, take care of a lot of problems. But they do some things very, very well, particularly those issues like addiction and homelessness, where one-on-one personal contact and commitment is very, very important. They bring advantages of motivated volunteers. They bring a faith perspective, which really treats, in many ways, the whole person in these contexts. So it's not just an economic approach. It's also a spiritual and moral approach often, which is what people crave and need in some of life's most difficult crises. And so I think they bring a number of advantages. So they have tremendous advantages. The scale is not large enough to meet many of the problems. I think we have to be realistic about that. And that's why I think it's important to look for ways to expand what they do in meeting important social problems.
And is organizing religions helping with the scale?
I would both agree with what Mike just said, and also to add that faith-based organizations are both, in some cases, very large. There are World Visions who are faith-based, but they're also uniquely small. And there's a sense in which faith-based groups are organized at a very local community level in ways that often other nonprofits just aren't kind of able to organize through congregations, through communities. And in doing so, there's a sense in which they really have a handle on the exact kind of human needs that they're dealing with that other nonprofits that are more professionalized just don't have. And so there's that other sense in which there's a personalization in faith-based groups that you often don't find in more kind of professional nonprofits.
What role should faith-based organizations play in shaping anti-poverty policy here in the U.S.?
Well, I think the important principle here is that government does have a responsibility to help those in need, but it doesn't always have the responsibility to provide those services directly itself by hiring a government bureaucrat. There are circumstances, not every circumstance, but often where government can promote the work of other institutions and that have unique advantages. Now, this is not new in a certain way. It's been going on in many cities for 100 years. New York City with Salvation Army and other charities. But the goal of the last, say, decade has been to not just work with the big charities, like big faith-based charities, like Salvation Army, like Lutheran Social Services, like the traditional ones, but getting down further into communities, trying to get resources to these community and faith-based institutions that know their people, know their problems, and have real solutions.
I would say, in the question of the faith-based community's role in public policy development, again, there's a sense in which they understand the whole person in a way that often a program that focuses on the material kind of conveyance of need, or maybe the technical training of skills, where faith-based groups can bring to the table understanding of the wholeness of who we are and how policy has to be able to be holistic in how it approaches that. And I think that's a unique role for faith-based and policy, for policymakers to understand, also to develop policies that kind of accommodate that understanding of how you mitigate problems.
You mentioned some of the larger groups that are doing it right, like recognizing and treating the whole person. What else are faith-based communities doing right? What are they able to do?
Well, I think one of the keys here, which you don't often talk about in public policy debates, is actually love and commitment. In many of these settings, when when an addict comes in with a kind of complex web of problems, radically disassociated from their community and family, they need more than just a program. Sometimes they need a friend, and sometimes when they're young they need a mentor, and they need someone who will take an active, kind of deeper role in their life. That's not often done by a public bureaucracy. It's more often done by people who are motivated by a sense of calling, many times volunteers themselves. And there's actually some good social science that shows that organizations like Big Brothers Big Sisters, not specifically faith-based, but very value-based, they do a good job with kids. They lower crime rates. They encourage school attendance. And I think that there's also some good, more than anecdotal evidence when it comes to addiction treatment and other, some of these other profound and deep problems. That faith-based institutions, because they bring this personalized approach, have advantages.
Where do you think, or how would you say, the conservative evangelical movement stands now, right now, on the poverty issue?
I think both Mike and I would have testified a pretty dramatic shift on this in terms of policy concern. But having said that, I mean, historically, the evangelical church has been very, very committed to meeting the real needs of the communities. It goes, frankly, hand in hand with the idea of sharing the good news spiritually, is kind of sharing the good news materially. That's been true with almost every revival that you've seen over the centuries, that, where the spiritual good news is given, that is followed by or is with the kind of meeting of material needs. And so I think the church has historically been a remarkable agent, practically for delivering services and addressing need. On the policy area, though, you've seen a pretty dynamic shift in the last probably 10 years. Younger evangelicals in particular focused on human rights issues and poverty issues, global poverty in particular. And I think that is a fairly new dynamic that I've noticed, Mike.
I agree. This is a case where the religious right, when it arose in the 70s and 80s, was largely a defensive movement against what were seen as aggressions of modernity when it came to abortion or it came to family or other issues. It didn't have a broad vision of social justice. It was really a reaction to specific challenges that they thought had been thrust upon them. That's shifting, particularly among the younger generation. I think there's a much broader vision of what it means to be a Christian in public life. It's not just being a moral conservative. It's also being concerned about the poor. It's also being concerned about global disease. It's being concerned about poverty in the developing world. You're seeing, I think, not so much a change, but a broadening going on in a lot of evangelical contexts. Some of that comes from a broader exposure to these problems. Young kids who do inner city trips and visits, or that do international travel to the developing world. And so, I think it's very, very positive.
One little anecdote on this. Baylor magazine, Baylor's a fairly prominent Christian school, and they have a monthly magazine, and they highlighted poverty on the most recent issue. And it was going to be just a single article on an earlier edition, and when they got into the student body to explore what they were doing on the issues of poverty, they found that the concern was so broad and there was so much going on, they dedicated the issue to it. And I think that is part of this reality, is it's not, there's something of a movement that's taking place. I think it's of the Spirit that's moving a lot of young evangelicals into the issues at a very practical level. Some are probably less oriented towards public policy, but they're just feeling called into kind of rolling up their sleeves. But from that eventually comes an appreciation for the systemic issues that aren't addressed only through direct ministry or mission work, and that do require some policy intervention. And so you do see, again, out of these experiences, a growing desire to also be involved in the advocacy of policy.
Mm-hmm.